Hello and welcome to our YouTube channel, the Ministry of the Real Truth. I am your host, the Couch Kumara. We are the Ministry of the Real Truth. We bring you the real truth, the whole truth and nothing but that truth. No hype, no fluff, no other silly nonsense. Today we are looking at a PDF on the Assyrian Church of the East history. This PDF book is free to download online and read at your own leisure. It's titled Moran Ith O. Dr. Ma Ephrem is the author. The Syrian Church of the East in the 20th century. Published around 2003. There is a picture of the author. And there his credits. The history of the Assyrian Church of the East in the 20th century, with special reference to the Syriac literature in Kerala. A thesis submitted to the Mahatma Gandhi University, Kottayam, that's possibly in India, for the degree of Doctor of Philosophy, PhD in Syriac, by Dr. Ma Ephrem Mukin, BDMTHSTMDTH. There is the Syriac, we believe. Editorial. The number of Moran Ithor is especially on more than one count. This number of Moran Ithor is special on more than one count. Its contents are the fruit of research done by the eminent Metropolitan Archbishop of the Assyrian Church of the East, Ma Ephrem. Ma just means master. It is also the first doctoral thesis prepared under the direction of the director of Syri, Dr. Jacob Theke Parambil, and presented to the Mahatma Gandhi University at Kottayam for doctorate in Syriac language and literature. It deals with the history of the church, of which the author is the Archbishop in India. The church traces its history right back to Apostolic times. This thesis, however, is confined to the 20th century. After the First World War, the church was decimated and went into diaspora, spread over Europe, America, Australia, New Zealand, etc. The ecumenical shift into close collaboration with the Vatican during the final decade of the century is a particularly noteworthy historical development. All the important events in this church during the last century are mentioned and discussed herein. Some precious Syriac documents preserved at Trichur have been translated into English and used in this thesis. The esteemed readers of Moran Ithor are sure to benefit by the pioneering research done by Archbishop Ma Ephrem. The editors are delighted to inform the subscribers that the Mahatma Gandhi University has accepted the thesis and decided to confer the PhD degree upon the author, who became the first doctor from Syri, Kottayam, Kerala, January 2003. And this is a declaration by the author. He hereby declared that this thesis is a bona fide, that means it's top notch, it's for real, true to life record of research work done by him, and that no part of the thesis has been presented earlier for the award of any degree, diploma or similar title of any other university. Ma Ephrem Mukin. and here's a certificate to certify that the thesis entitled The History of the Assyrian Church of the East in the 20th Century, with special reference to the Syriac literature in Kerala, is a record of studies and research carried out by Dr. Ephrem under this person's supervision and guidance, and that no part of this thesis has been presented earlier, again is stating the same thing, for the award of any degree, diploma, fellowship, title or recognition. It's Friar Dr. Jacob Thekaparambil, Sia Kottayam, Kerala, 20th October 2000. And the acknowledgements. Different spellings. Different writers, according to their preference, have used some proper names, since it is not advisable to change the spellings of the words, especially in quotations. The following list is provided. Contents of this book, this PDF. You can download it free online. We may leave a link underneath this video so you can do that and read it at your own leisure. This is the contents page. The history of the Assyrian Church of the East since the time of King Addai, who's known as the Black, Uchama in the 1st century until the end of the 19th century. Chapter 3, from Patriarch Ma rule Shamun until the murder of Patriarch Ma Binyamin Shamun. Chapter 5, period of uncertainty, 1918 to 1933. From the beginning of the reign of Patriarch Ma Palus Shamun till the massacre of the Assyrians at Samala, northern Iraq, in August 1933. The period of suffering, 1933 to 1975, from the period of exile of Patriarch Ma Ishai Shamun in Cyprus till his assassination in 1975. Dinka IV may have been assassinated as well. And then you see appendices, conclusions, appendices, bibliography, books by the author, and a map of the Assyrian churches 600 AD, and so forth. About the author on the back cover. Chapter 1, Introduction. One. Previous research. The history of the Assyrian Church of the East in the 20th century has not been written so far. Or at that point, right? At the same time, students of the church history will agree that the 20th century is a very eventful period in the history of this much persecuted church. Yeah, persecuted for like 18 centuries or something like that. And it mentions here Professor John Joseph's book, The Nestorians and Their Muslim Neighbours, deals with this topic in part 2. The 20th century, although that is a very useful study, his 20th century ends before the end of the first half of the 20th century. Much water has flown under the rivers Euphrates and Tigris since then. The war between Iraq and Iran from 1980 to 1988 had increased the number of refugees from both countries. Iraq's occupation of Kuwait on 2nd August 1990 and the American bombing of Baghdad and suburbs in January 1991 had affected adversely the members of the Assyrian Church of the East, and so forth. There's more information there. It's quite faded because it's an old book, a copy of an old book. Some more information. Different writers. (1900 to 2000) is the period covered in this book. During the year 2000, the ecumenical relations are excellent. The Assyrian Church of the East at present, or then, presents a better picture of the affairs of the Church. The writer of this dissertation has first-hand knowledge of the happenings in this church during the past 4 decades, and so forth. Note: 2 patriarchs, namely Mar Benjamin Shimon and Mar Ishai Shimon, patriarch in 1957, uncle and nephew, were shot dead in entirely different circumstances. At present, or at that time, the hereditary succession followed in the patriarchal family had ended. The church then decided not to consecrate bishops for tribes. Bishops and metropolitans are consecrated for geographical areas such as cities and countries. And there's the history of the Assyrian Church in the 20th century, divided. Objectives of this book. Importance of this research. Details of procedure. The writer of this dissertation wrote a BD thesis, which is a bachelor's degree, thesis on Nestorius when he was 20 years old. Later in 1966 he wrote a master's thesis and also a doctorate thesis, D.Th, in 1976. Several papers on this topic were written even after obtaining a doctorate. Bibliography. Syriac books and manuscripts were consulted, and English and Malayan records were scrutinized in order to leave for posterity an accurate account of the history of this church during 1900 to 2000 AD. As far as the Christian community is concerned, 2000 AD would mark 204 years of settling this Christian community from the neighborhood of Chuchu. The name of the church. The Church of the East is known in history by various names. The name the Assyrian Church is known in many circles. As the majority of the Church of the East members are Assyrian, ethnically this name is preferred. At the same time, this church is known by the name the Nestorian Church in many books authored by Catholic as well as Protestant writers. It is a nickname because when most of the churches condemned Nestorius was hypostasis theory, that Christ had 2 natures, 2 substances, that he was both human and divine, or both divine and human. The Church of the East refused to condemn Nestorius, as it was felt that Nestorius did not teach any heretical ideas in his refusal to call the Blessed Virgin Mary Mother of God, or Theotokos. Now, the Church of the East does not normally use the name the Nestorian Church, lest it should create the wrong notion among outsiders that it was Nestorius who founded this ancient church. As they said, something we had read online, there was a debate between Cyril, a Roman Catholic, and Nestorius. And Nestorius stated about Christ being of 2 substances, having 2 natures, both human and divine. And Cyril got all upset and started calling him a heretic, and from there on the Nestorian Church, or the Apostolic Church of the East, was called heretic and condemned and persecuted for supposedly 18 to 20 centuries. And attacked by many because they said, yes, they agreed with Nestorius, they had the same belief thousands of years before he stated it. So that's why they were called heretics, persecuted, etc. But seeing as the name is stuck, they use it, even though there was a letter sent to, or argument between, or some statement between two people, and this other person had called them Nestorians. So this patriarch had said to him, if you keep calling us Nestorians, we'll have to go to war. You see, that's what they're saying. Nestorius wasn't the one who founded the ancient church. They were erroneously given that label, Nestorians. The present writer has used this name in many of his books, like the Nestorian Fathers, Nestorian Missions, Nestorian Theology. As a matter of fact, he is one of the opinion that the church should not feel guilty of using that name, for that name Nestorian is not without honour in history. The great expansion to China, Japan, Tibet, Sri Lanka, etc. in the history of the church is recorded in that name. The Church of the East in Thrissur is locally known as the Chaldean Syrian. Church. But outside India, the name Chaldean refers to the branch of the Church of the East that accepted the supremacy of the Pope of Rome. In the 19th century, two metropolitans, namely Mar Thomas Rokos and Mar Elia Yohanan Melas, served this church. They were consecrated and sent to Thrissur by Patriarch Mar Joseph Aldo, who was under the Roman jurisdiction. He sent these metropolitans against the wishes of Rome. Therefore they worked in Thrissur without the permission of the Pope. The representatives of Vatican worked against both these metropolitans and saw that they were ordered back to Babel. The name Babel is used because the patriarchs were known as the patriarchs of Babel or Babylon. Different names of this church are used in this dissertation because various authors and documents quoted here had used these different names. The official name, however, is the Church of the East. The title of the dissertation used the name the Syrian Church of the East, as almost all the members of this church, except those in India, as well as a few in the two non-Assyrian congregations in the USA, are Assyrians. The history of the Assyrian Church of the East since the time of King Agga-Ukama, or known as the Black, in the 1st century till the end of the 19th century. Little history on that king. He was ill and heard of Yeshua Mashiach, or Jesus the Messiah, and his miracles healing people of leprosy, returning sight to the blind, etc., etc. So he wanted him to come and visit him and cure him. And he says, oh, you can come and live in our country, it's all safe, so you'll be welcome here, etc., etc. But Christ says, oh, I'm too busy going about my Father's work, I can't come, sorry, but I will send one of mine, like a disciple, to you. Yeah? This is an exchange of in a letter from one to the other. Introduction. The period from the 1st century to the end of the 19th century is treated below in an attempt to understand this church before we plunge into the detailed history of the Church of the East in the 20th century. We are not looking into the details of the earlier centuries, but making only a cursory glance at the vicissitudes of history that this ancient church went through. As it has shrunk to a small church, many Christians have the wrong notion that it was a small denomination. Many ask the author the question, when did your church come into being? Was it Nestorius or later? Many Christians, unfortunately, in spite of the ecumenical context of today, have no idea of this church or its admirable historic past. The early period. Some Assyrians, proud of their ethnic heritage, know of King Nebuchadnezzar, but do not realize that King Nebuchadnezzar was not a Christian. Hence, a retelling of the story of King Agga-Ukama becomes a necessity. According to the tradition of King Agga-Ukama, Tetrarch of Edessa, which some historians dismiss as mere tradition, Christianity came to Edessa by the decision of Jesus Christ himself. When Abgar Ukama wrote a letter to Jesus Christ, inviting him to his little kingdom to cure the illness of his son, so it was the illness of his son, and live comfortably in his kingdom, Jesus himself replied by a letter stating that his time was up, and so he would not be able to come to Edessa. He was going to be crucified. I think that's what he's hitting at, and then be resurrected. So it was about his father's will, right? What he was destined to do and fulfill. However, his disciples would come and heal the sickness of his son. After the death of Jesus, his disciple Addai went to Edessa and cured the sickness of the son of King Abgar Ushama and evangelized the kingdom of Edessa. Apparently someone went there with the shroud or the cloth of Christ and gave it to him, and supposedly somebody stole it and it ended up in Turin. Some scholars think that this is an unhistorical legend and do not give it any historical weight. However, the members of the Church of the East believe in this tradition, whether one wants to call it history or tradition. Eusebius of Caesarea, in his ecclesiastical history, states that he has examined the archives in Alexandria and found out that the letter written by Jesus was genuine. Here's a footnote here. The discovery was made in the 4th century. Now the letter is not available, and we cannot debate on the genuineness of the letter of King Abgar and the reply which Jesus sent. Therefore, let us rely on what Eusebius of Caesarea, the famous church historian of the 4th century, had recorded. Thus, Edessa becomes the first nation as a whole to become Christian. There's some skepticism about this Eusebius guy, that he may have been a fabricator, a liar, etc. But go do your own personal research on that. This is just what we've come across. The Church of the East believes that it was founded by Addai and Mari. Some believe that Addai is Saint Thaddeus, one of the 12 disciples of Jesus. Mari is said to be one of the 70 whom Jesus sent. Perhaps Mari was a disciple of Addai. As a modern Western scholar, Dr. W.A. Wigram is emphatic that Addai and Mari organised a church in Edessa in the 1st century itself. On the other hand, there were some doubting Thomases that did not pay much attention to the existence of Christianity in Edessa in the 1st century, and there's a footnote. Persian church is not the daughter church of Antioch. It is a daughter church of Edessa. Later, Edessa came under the Patriarch of Antioch, but the church in Persia has asserted its independence. In the Council of 315 AD in Seleucia, in the Persian church, Papa Bar Gagai did not agree with the Council of Miles, Bishop of Susa, and Akib Allaha, Bishop of Kirkuk. Simon Bar Sabak, Archdeacon of Papa Bar Gagai, was consecrated as rival to Papa. As a result, Simon Bar Sabak remained as Archdeacon until the death of Papa around 326 or 327. Then Simon Bar Sabak became Catholicos in 339 AD. Simon Bar Sabak was martyred, or was killed, along with hundreds of clergy during the terrible persecutions of the Persian king Sapor II around 339 to 379. That's probably when he lived and died. In the Synod of Catholicos Mar Isaac in 410 AD, the independence of the Persian church was evident. In the Synod of Patriarch Mar Thaddeus in 424 AD at Markup, the decision was made to appeal to Westerners. That means Edessa, not Antioch. Compared David Royal, The Persian Schism, Voice from the Past, from the East, Volume 17, Number 2, May, July 1998, Chicago, paragraph 1 to 4. It's basically telling you to compare that with this statement. The episcopate of Papa Bear Gagai around 300 AD is considered the starting point of the Church of the East by some scholars. W.A. Wigram clarifies that the episcopate of Papa is a definite and important turning point in the history of the Church, though not the starting point which they inclined to make it. Seleucia Ctesiphon near Baghdad became the headquarters of this church. Very soon, Edessa was a buffer city-state between the Roman Empire and the Persian Empire. During the imperial wars, the people of Edessa suffered heavily in the 4th century. At the time of Mar Ephrem, 306 to 373, as a result of the war, many Edessans became refugees, and Mar Ephrem, the deacon, had to take care of the orphans and hungry people. The official website of the Syrian Church of the East has the following information regarding the origin of the church. Where did it begin? The Church of the East developed first in what was known as the Parthian Empire, and when that empire was overthrown by the Persians in the 3rd century, it continued its development under the Persian government. This was the region lying to the east of the Roman border, stretching as far to India. The exact location of the church's first congregations cannot be established from the historical record, but it is thought that it began its most serious development in the region of Adiabin in northern Mesopotamia, spreading from there in all directions throughout the empire. Here's some of W.A. Wigram's book. The Assyrian people of Upper Mesopotamia have always been an important part of the Church of the East, though historically there were only one ethnic group among many others within the Church. However, today they represent the single surviving cultural grouping. Though the Church moved far beyond its beginnings in Upper Mesopotamia, the language of that region, Syriac, remained the language of the Church, and its vocabulary, with a certain amount of Greek added to it, was the source of its characteristic theological formulation. How is it organized? The Church of the East is governed according to the Apostolic model of bishops, presbyters, and deacons. And more information there. Church grew in Seleucia to Siphon, now in ruins near Baghdad. The Christians of the Persian Empire did not have to face the persecutions which the Christians in the Roman Empire suffered. Still, there were 3 major persecutions against him under the following rulers. Sapor II, born 339, died 379. There's a couple of other ones here. And some more information. Okay, this is what we were talking about earlier. In the history of this church, the Council of Patriarch Mar Thaddeus in 424 AD is an important event. The Synod decided that no appeals would be made to the West. It is a declaration of the autonomy of this church. For political reasons, the Christians in the Persian Empire did not show any affinity to the people of the Roman Empire. Since the Persian emperors were Zoroastrians, the Christians of Persia wanted to declare that they were different from the Christians of the Roman Empire. Such an opportunity came with the unfortunate Christological controversy between Cyril of Alexandria and Nestorius of Antioch. The Church of the East did not participate in any of the rival councils held under Cyril of Alexandria, later supported by the legates of Rome, or in the rival council presided over by Bishop John of Antioch, supported by Nestorius of Constantinople. The church in Persia was not involved in this controversy. However, when they later heard about it, they supported Nestorius, although John of Antioch agreed to accept the expression Theotokos in 433 AD, 2 years after the rival councils of Ephesus issued anathemas and counter-anathemas. The birth of Prophet Muhammad in the year 570 AD had serious repercussions for the Church of the East. Since Khadijah is the rich lady and the first wife of the Prophet Muhammad was a member of this church, it had constant contact with Islam from its inception. Khadijah consulted her cousin Warqa when Muhammad had vision of Allah in his sleep. Warqa said that the Ruh Qudusha, Holy Spirit, Ruach HaKodesh, inspired it. The Prophet tolerated Christians. Yeah, we did a video on Muhammad, and he was a nice guy to that Syrian church. He let them do their thing, but the caliphate after him, or his first caliphate, was very cruel to them and started persecuting them etc., etc.